Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome. I'm Ross, and I'm live from the Athenaeum in Jackson, Louisiana, home of Horeb Institute for the Historical and Objective Research and Exploration of the Bible, and home of United Israel World Union Center South. Thank you very much for joining me today for my class after Horeb's Day of Assembly. As you know, we are working through the Pentateuch. According to the annual cycle of readings, we are in the book of Exodus. This covers basically the Torah portion Mishpatim, or more precisely, I'm going to cover today a lesson that is derived from Torah portion Mishpatim. Mishpatim contains all sorts of things that we're not going to get into today in the class. But I want to take a careful look at something that I think is important, and I think it's probably going to prove, many of you know the basic method I'm going to be talking about today, but it's going to prove to be one of the most valuable tools that you'll ever receive when it comes to studying the books and the teachings within the Pentateuch. Now, one of the things that I want you to know is that according to the chronology of things in the Torah text, we are still at Horeb, and we're going to be at Horeb according to the way that the text flows until we get to the book of Numbers and the 10th chapter. So from the time we begin roughly around Exodus chapter 17, all the way through the book of Exodus, all the way through the book of Leviticus. Leviticus is presented, by the way, as being conveyed in a very short period of time, and it's considered to be, according to the text given at Horeb, Numbers chapter 1 through 9, and even the first part of chapter 10 is presented as coming from Horeb. And then Deuteronomy is often read as secondary retellings. I don't agree with this view, but a lot of people read it as a secondary retelling of events that are described elsewhere in the Pentateuch, in Exodus or in Leviticus or in Numbers. But be that as it may, the stories from the time at Horeb make up almost everything that we get in the book, from the book of Exodus 17 until the end of the Pentateuch. So we're going to be looking at something very interesting in that regard. Now, many students of the Bible miss the fact that the Pentateuch can be studied what we would call synoptically. Now, some of you know the word synoptic, but if you break that word down, the S-Y-N, sin, means together, and the word optic, most of you will recognize that immediately, optic is viewed. So what I want to teach today is the method whereby we view things together. We find certain stories that are in Exodus that are also maybe in the book of Numbers and or also in the book of Deuteronomy. And it's only when we can align those that we can begin to fully understand and appreciate the comparisons and the contrast between these different sources. Now, those of you who have studied with me for quite some time know of this method of study, as I've often described it, as horizontal studies. So we're going to be taking a look at one snapshot of the time at Horeb, and we're going to be looking at it synoptically. We're going to be looking at it from the perspective of the writer of Exodus and the writer of Deuteronomy. And one of the things that I want to stress today that I've been saying for quite some time, but I want it to be crystal clear, is that anyone who carefully reads the sources, in other words, if you pick up your Bible and you read from Exodus, from the time that we meet Moses until the end of Deuteronomy, anyone who objectively, carefully, critically reads those stories all the way through, they will not come away with the idea naturally that this is one singular author. That is a traditional teaching that finds no support in the text himself. So we're going to be looking at that. But this horizontal study is going to prove to be very valuable as we work through the text. Horizontal study is going to allow us to compare and contrast text and sections of text, narratives. So, for instance, a lot of times we know of a certain narrative in a certain form, but we never really look at those narratives together. And even if we know that there are various stories, different narratives of a singular story, we rarely look at those side by side. And that's what I want to change through this method of teaching. So I'll give you an example. We know from the Bible's book of Numbers, chapter 13 and 14, of a narrative of the spies, as we're called, as the Bible calls it, the spies in English. We also get an episode of the spies recounted in Deuteronomy chapter 1. Now, very few people look at those side by side, but it's instructive to do so because we see differences. And many people will try to ignore those differences. Many people will try to say that the differences are not that significant. But I would challenge that. I would say it's significant enough to take notice of, and it's significant enough to show that the same author didn't write these. And some might say, well, maybe the same author did, but it was 40 years later, and things have slipped in Moses' mind. It's not the way I'd like to think of things. I'd like to show it for what it is. So we're going to be talking about some narrative differences. And what is surprising to me is that students of the Pentateuch rarely look at the Pentateuchal stories in this way. Rarely do people who study the Pentateuch even consider looking at these stories side by side. Now, any good study Bible, if you pick up a study Bible and you're reading, for instance, Numbers chapter 13, there might even be a heading that says the story of the spies. And then there might even be a footnote or a center column reference that points one to Deuteronomy chapter 1. But very seldom do people put these side by side, and this is where the true value of this method of study is. Now, as I've often pointed out, New Testament scholars have had this figured out for hundreds of years. And I think it's quite interesting. It's almost as if the scholars of the New Testament and scholars of the Hebrew Bible are in different rooms, and they never open up the door and say, hey, man, how's it going in there? Or, hey, lady, how's it going in there? Have you discovered any methods that might benefit me? And my field of study, they don't share, they don't talk, they don't look at one another's work. And I think that is tragic. Now, the only reason that I came to think of using this method on the text of the Pentateuch is because I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian environment. And so I was familiar with what we call the gospel parallels, synoptics studies. So, for instance, here is one of the books that I have in my library. It's the Gospel Parallels. It's called Throckmorton, a synopsis of the first three Gospels. I mean, I have a shelf of these. Here is another one, synopsis of the four Gospels. And what is amazing about this is people can take stories, and this is not a gospel class, by the way, but it's very instructive. So you have to listen to this, even if you don't like this gospel stuff. But here's the deal. If you want to look at a certain story in the gospel that's told in different sources, in different gospels, here you have them side by side. And you'll notice by studying this way that certain writers, whether the writer of Matthew, the writer of Mark, the writer of Luke, and certainly the writer of John is different, primarily the synoptics, though, because they can be seen together because they're very similar. But when you look at these, you can look and notice that there are differences and there are similarities between the stories. Now, the main difference is that the fundamentalist who is Tanakh only or is Hebrew Bible only doesn't want to think that the Hebrew Bible has anything like the Gospels in terms of differences in the narratives. But that is not true. There is nothing that could be further than the truth, than that thought. So we have to look at these stories side by side. When we look at these harmonies of the Gospels, we look at them side by side, we learn valuable elements of the sources behind these Gospels. It would serve us well to do the same thing for the stories in the Pentateuch, because we see at least as many differences, call them discrepancies, call them variations in the accounts as we see in the Gospels. We see as many in the Torah as we see in the Gospels. Now, look, I know that there are a lot of popular YouTubers out there who make a living pointing out and giggling and smirking at discrepancies between Gospel accounts. And they think that this is hilarious. But then they present a story of the Pentateuch text, and they would never bring up anything like that there. So what I was curious about several years ago was what are the chances that someone out there has produced a synoptic of the Pentateuch stories? I mean, I really wanted to know. I mean, surely somebody's thought of this. But, and I've challenged people before as I've taught this Torah portion and I've taught this subject matter before, I've asked people, you try to find it. Because I spent a good deal of time trying to discover or find somewhere out there a synoptic where you lay out the life and laws of Moses, say from Exodus chapter 2 until the end of Deuteronomy, in this synoptic pattern where you can view similar stories together side by side and look for, you can compare and contrast. But imagine if we had such a tool. Now, I did look to try to discover on the internet. I mean, I did quite a bit of extensive digging trying to find that, and I found two books that helped me quite a bit, and I've mentioned one of these. This is A Harmony of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles by William Day Crockett. All right, I got this one. I think I got this one first. I liked it okay. I saw this one advertised. This is the one that I'm constantly referring my students and fellow students to, and it's a synoptic harmony of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles with related passages from Psalms, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezra. This is edited by James D. Newsom Jr. Highly recommend. The links, by the way, are in the description of this video, or you can go to rossknichols.com and you'll see on our recommended page, this is near the top of the list. This particular book and this particular method of study changed everything for me. I cannot express to you what a change came over me when I began to look at different stories told by different sources, or I should say, maybe, the same stories told by different sources, and I began to observe that the variations were incredible. So, for instance, to study a particular story from the book of Kings and to look at that same story by the writer of Chronicles, to look at the writer of Kings versus the chronicler, will blow your mind. And I know that people often are a little bit taken aback that we've got such difference in the storytelling. Now, I think a lot of people will try to minimize that, and they'll try to say, well, you know, that's not that significant. But if you are of that thought process, you haven't really looked closely, and I don't mean that as an insult. I mean, I was there at one time too. I didn't think that, you know, I think I was pretty familiar with the writer of Kings and the stories as were told by Kings. And I was pretty familiar with the chronicler and how the chronicler told the stories. But only when I looked at those stories side by side was I able to fully, realize how different these sources really are. But I'm telling you that this horizontal study revolutionized my understanding of the Bible, of the writers of the Bible, and their particular worldview. And I was absolutely floored, and I highly encourage people to look into this. On the differences between the narrative sources, whether we're talking about the chronicler, the histories, or that sort of thing, or we're talking about the Pentateuch, what I would say about the differences is what others avoid or try to explain away, I embrace and seek to bring delight, because we have to look at these, we have to face these in order to solve some of the greatest mysteries of the biblical text. So that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with sources. We're dealing with different writers in different times and sometimes in different places who are telling stories, and the only way to get at the original source is to study the sources as we have them and compare source to source. Now, whenever we look at, say, for instance, the book of Kings and Chronicles, these are some examples that I usually go to, and some of you know some of these. But let me just give you one example from this book, a Synoptic Harmony. If you have it already, go to page 245. And what 245, what this section of the book is doing, it's giving the story, the reign of Josiah and the discovery of the book of the law. And so if we read the two side by side, what you're looking at basically is 2 Kings 23, 4 and following, and 2 Chronicles 34, 3 and following. And it says, for instance, in Chronicles, in the 8th year of his reign, talking about Josiah, Josiah would have been 16 because he took the throne. He became king at 8. So the 8th year of his reign, while he was yet a boy, he began to seek the God of David, his father. And in the 12th year, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of the high places, the Asherim and the graven and the molten images. So if we read Chronicles, what we say when we look at Chronicles is that it's obvious that according to the chronicler, Josiah began to cleanse and purge Jerusalem of idolatry by the time he was 16, and by the time he's 20 years old, he's already begun to really get into heavy revival in the land. Now, that doesn't agree with what we see in Kings. So what Kings and Chronicles both say is that in the 18th year of King Josiah, a scroll is discovered in the temple. And the scroll is claimed to be, according to both texts, the scroll that Moses wrote. According to Kings, it's after the discovery of the scroll that Josiah rips his garments. He realizes that they've not been living according to the standards of the Torah of Moses, and he calls for this great purge and so forth. But according to chroniclers, there was a scroll discovered, and yes, it brought about further reforms. But, Josiah was a good boy already. He had already begun these things. It's a difference worth noting. It's worth noting because as we look at these things, it's very important to discern what is the writer focused on here. How is the writer presenting the characters in the story? What can we learn from their particular approach? Now, I'm currently working on a case called the Jehoash inscription. You're hearing about it first right here, right now. In fact, I don't know if I should get into this too much, but I'll just say that there is an inscription known as the Jehoash inscription. You can look it up, but be warned, what you're going to find is the consensus view. This was one of two objects, the other being the James ossuary, owned by a collector in Israel by the name of Oded Galan. And this particular object was one of two objects. Oded Galan was put on trial. The trial lasted almost 8 years. It's called the Trial of the Century. I'm doing a lot of research on this right now. And Oded Galan was charged with, and later, he was later off. In other words, the judge said, no, he's not guilty of this. But he was charged with forgery, claiming that both of these objects are forged. Now, I've read a lot on these both ways, and some of you might be saying, yeah, I've read all that, and both of those are forgeries. Not so fast. We're looking at it right now. So in other words, the Jehoash inscription, the story of Jehoash is told in Kings and Chronicles. So this was my first stop. I wanted to go look at the story of Jehoash according to Kings and Chronicles, and it is amazing what you can learn. This inscription claims to be a royal inscription by King Jehoash, or someone who wrote it on his behalf, from First Temple times of a great restoration of the temple. And many people have dismissed this as a forgery. But if it's not, and I'm currently inclined to believe that it is authentic, it is the oldest, the earliest, there's nothing compares in terms of a royal inscription. But the first place we go whenever we want to study something like this discovered archaeologically is to the biblical text. But you'll hear more about that in the future. But the differences often between these accounts are not insignificant. Not only are they not insignificant, they give away the intention of the writer. Let me give you an example. If I want to talk to you about David, the life of David, and I want to look at the story in 2 Samuel 11 and 1 Chronicles 20, by the way, the same story is told in both, but with great difference. Go to page 46 to 49 in a Synoptic Harmony, if you have this. Okay, so let's see if you recognize this story. In the spring of the year, I'm reading from 2 Samuel 11 and 1 Chronicles 20, but I'm going to read them together where they agree. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go forth to battle, David sent Joab, his servants, with him, and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. Everybody say, uh-oh. David remained in Jerusalem. Now, the writer of Samuel then goes into telling a story about how David, while in Jerusalem, goes and looks out and sees a woman bathing on her roof by the name of Bathsheba. And he takes her, he gets her pregnant, ultimately has her husband killed. You remember the story. This story is horror. Imagine any politician today having something like this written about them. But guess what? The story in 2 Samuel 11 and 1 Chronicles 20 are remarkably different, and it makes us ask why. How different are they, Ross? Well, let me tell you. Only because of 2 Samuel do we know about Bathsheba and the death of Uriah and Nathan accusing David and the birth of the child and all of that. None of that is in Chronicles. Let me tell you what Chronicles says. 1 Chronicles 20. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go forth to battle, Joab led out the army and ravaged the country of the Ammonites and came and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. Listen, and then it gets silent, silent, silent. And then the verse continues in 1 Chronicles 20, and Joab smote Rabbah and overthrew it, and David took the crown of their king from his head. What happened to the story of Bathsheba? What happened to the story of Nathan, where he goes into the king and challenges him? And it's a huge part of the David story. The question has to be, why does the chronicler leave it out? And what we'll find is that by carefully studying these things, if people begin to study these things side by side, what you'll notice is great differences in the narrative, and they are for a reason, right? It's not just, in other words, the chronicler didn't leave this section out because he said, well, I look over here and it looks like Samuel's written this already. No need to repeat it here. No, the chronicler has a reason to leave it out. And specifically, if I had to guess, I would say it is to protect the image of David. We see the chronicler because it is the official court record. It is the official Judean record. So quite often, even when a king is not godly, certain forgivenesses are extended to those kings that the writer of the book of Kings does not extend. So they're different. So we have no problem. Most people would say, well, okay, I see that. I'm okay if we have differences between the written record in Kings and the written record in Chronicles, but they have more of a difficulty in admitting or conceding that the Pentateuch has variations within the stories. And I think that has robbed us of advances in our understanding of the text. Now, as historians, what I would say is we should carefully study all available sources, right? We shouldn't leave something out, and we certainly shouldn't minimize these variations in the text because we think we're doing God a favor or we think we're defending the text. We should always talk about the distinctions between one written record and another. Otherwise, we're not going to discern any historical accuracy between the two accounts. We should consider all variations in all accounts, and that's part of what we're doing in textual criticism, source criticism. It's all an attempt to get back at as close as we can to the authentic record before it was corrupted in later times. Now, the question becomes, what can these differences teach us about the authors and their sources? If we look at, when we look at these sources, we're looking at time, we're looking at place, we're looking at people, we're looking at the author, and we're looking at the author's motivations. Just like in the example of Chronicles. Chronicles leaves out the story of David and Bathsheba. What could motivate the chronicler to do that? That should be fairly simple to figure out. There are other texts, when we look at the differences, we should say, where is this author writing from? What is the person? Is it a man? Is it a woman? Is it a Judean? Is it someone in the south? Is it someone in the north? What's the motivation behind the written record? All of these things are important. Now, the Pentateuch, you can write this down because we're going to show it time and again. The Pentateuch does contain variants in narrative sources. There is no doubt. These are not easily explained away. These are not things that you can dismiss as, well, Moses, he's getting old, he's had a lapse in his memory. He's not looking at anything in writing before himself. None of those excuses work. We have differences in the narratives. And again, no one, if you took someone who is not approaching the text from a traditional standpoint, someone who's not familiar with the text, and you gave them a copy, a good translation of the Pentateuch, and you said, read this, and at the end of it, they come back and give it to you, and then you ask them, what's your impression on who wrote that? Is it one author or more? I would venture to say that no one approaching this objectively would say that it's written by a singular author. It just doesn't have that feel. The only reason that people feel that it's written by one is because they've been told that that's what they should believe. And they put things on the text that the text doesn't put on itself. They make claims for the text, which the text itself does not claim. What I'm here to do today, unfortunately, if you are a fundamentalist, is to say to you that I can love you and I can appreciate our friendship, but I have to tell you the truth. And the truth is that we have variations, and we have to look at these. We have to carefully study these all the way through if we're going to be honest to Moses and, as I like to say, honest to God. The differences within the Pentateuchal text are as different in some instances as Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, and every bit as different as what we find in the New Testament Gospels. So again, for those people, and I have acquaintances who really make a lot of, they gain a lot of followers by pointing out and snickering at differences in gospel narratives. Well, you know, as we say, if you live in a glass house, so when we read the Pentateuch sources, we see some of these same things. These differences should not be ignored or explained away. Today, what we're going to do, we're going to take a snapshot. I've got a document that is in the description. I think it's been posted in the chat as well. And I want you to download that. I want you to look at it. You can, even if you can't watch me and look at that, look at that. I'm not doing any tricks here today. So just keep an eye on the text. We're going to talk about this document. We're going to go through it. I'm going to have other texts to read as well. But the reason that I want this document before you is because I've created, for the purpose of this class, a synoptic harmony, if you will, of the text between Exodus and Deuteronomy. And here's what we're going to focus on. Today, we're looking at what our Pentateuch sources record about the events following, according to the text, according to the narrative, in both sources, God speaking audibly to an assembled group at Horeb, right? So it's what we're looking at, just to look at the differences between the two narratives contained in, actually it's more than two, but we'll talk about Exodus and Deuteronomy's versions, plural, versions of the events that took place after the giving of the 10 words. Aseret HaDevarim, it's called. The book of Deuteronomy has a name for that day. Now, I, for the life of me, have wondered why the Bible doesn't explicitly have a festival for this event. There's nothing like this event in all of human history. And we're not going to go there, but Deuteronomy 4:32 and following says, ask now, from the beginning of time, from the time men were in the garden, basically, man and woman in the garden, until today, has there ever been a God speaking out of the midst of fire, etc.? So this is a unique day. We have a festival for Pesach. We have a festival for unleavened bread. We have, unless, and this is what I've come to think might be the case, unless somehow the festival of Shavuot is somehow commemorative of this day. Now, Judaism does present that to be the case. But Deuteronomy doesn't give a date, nor does Exodus, for the giving of, or for this particular day, although we are pretty certain that we're in the third month, okay? So that at least puts some credibility toward Judaism's determination that this is early in the third month, and therefore it is what we would associate with Shavuot. But Deuteronomy calls the day, one specific phrase is used. It's called the Day of Assembly, the Day of Assembly. So what I'd like you to do is go with me. We're going to look at 3 texts in Deuteronomy. Again, this is only in Deuteronomy. Nowhere else is this particular day given a name. So let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 9 and verse 10. Deuteronomy 9 and verse 10. And Jehovah delivered unto me the 2 tables of stone written with the finger of God, and on them was written according to all the words which Jehovah spake with you in the mount out of the midst of the fire in the day of the assembly. Now, this particular day of the assembly, again, phrase only occurs 3 times in all of the Pentateuch. Now, some people might look and say, well, I found the word assembly somewhere else. No. Specifically, day of the assembly. The day of the assembly, Bayom HaKahal, on the day of the assembly. Now look at Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 4. And he wrote on the tables, according to the first writing, the 10 commandments which Jehovah spake unto you in the mount, out of the midst of the fire, in the day of the assembly, and Jehovah gave them to me. All right, you see that? So it's very specifically the day of the assembly is the day, according to the writer of Deuteronomy, that God spoke audibly from the midst of the fire on the mountain. The people are assembled. That's why it's called Bayom HaKahal, the day of the assembly. One more text, please. Go with me, Deuteronomy 18 and verse 16. According to all that thou desirest of Jehovah thy God in Horeb in the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear again the voice of Jehovah my God, neither let me see this great fire any more, lest I die. All right. Now, so the day of the assembly, what I want to do is look at what immediately follows that awe-inspiring event on the day of the assembly. And I'm going to look at the accounts in Exodus and the accounts in Deuteronomy. And basically what we're dealing with is we have narratives in Exodus 19, 20, 24, 31, and 32 that we're going to be looking at. And then we have Deuteronomy 5, 9, and 18. And what typically happens is people read not horizontally. They'll maybe they follow traditionally, they follow the Torah cycles, and they read through the book of Exodus, and then you have 12 cycles of Exodus readings, and then you have 12, say, of Leviticus, and then 12 of Numbers, and by the time you get to it again in Deuteronomy, you're not focused on, I mean, generally you think, well, the story, I read this some time back. But unless you put them side by side, you don't notice the differences between the two narratives. So as we work through, when we're working through these particular texts, we're looking specifically for differences. Now, we're going to start with this idea that there is a certain reaction and response of the people to this awe-inspiring event. But also what I want you to look at as we work through is the order, the way that things are reported. So for instance, when were the 10 words, which according to the narratives are written with God's finger on the stone, when are those given to Moses, right? Is it right after the words are spoken, or is there some delay in the narrative? And the answer to that is, it depends on where you read. So we're going to look at this, and we're going to see if we can make some sense out of the chronology and see if if by looking at them side by side, if we can order the events the way that that more accurately represents perhaps an original story that was later amended by various scribes, okay? So this is going to be an interesting exercise. So what follows is a comparative review of two accounts, that at least two, found within a sacred genre, which I refer to as sacred history. Not necessarily like some people want to use modern ideas of historicity and historical reckoning and historical writing and put that on the ancient writers. We're beyond that. I mean, anyone who knows the literature and who studies this, we can find plenty of answers that can explain some of that. In other words, people who doubt the historicity of any of this, they do so at their own peril, I would say. So what I want to do is think of this as sacred history, which is its own special genre, and we're going to look at this as we work through. So overall, here's sort of a summary of what we're going to look at in a very detailed way on the sheet. All right, so think about this. We have an unknown date called by the writer of Deuteronomy the Day of Assembly. God spoke to an assembled group, conveying his 10 words. People feared greatly and requested Moses speak to them from now on. And as a trade-off, the people said that they agreed to listen, and the people felt that they would die if they heard God speak to them in this way again. According to both narratives, later, Moses goes back to the mountain alone, stays 40 days and nights, and receives 2 stone tablets written with the finger of God, okay? So, and we're going to look at this in great detail in the sheet, but just stick with me. This is sort of an overview. Now, Exodus and Deuteronomy both have these narrative elements. Exodus and Deuteronomy, the things that I just covered in the overall summary, they both have. But the language is different, the writing is different, the narrative details are different. Now, what many people will do is they'll say, hey, here's the deal. If they were exact, we wouldn't trust them. I don't disagree. But that's not why they're different. They're different because they're from a different hand, right? So a lot of people, they want to hold on to the traditional view that Moses wrote all these things, but they don't want to consider that they're from a different pen. A lot of people will say that the reason there are differences is because Exodus represents the original. Exodus represents the original telling, and then Deuteronomy is recalling somewhat imprecisely the events from the book of Exodus. Again, it's been decades, and the details are a little bit fuzzy maybe. That's the way most people try to explain this, and I just don't think that that's appropriate. I don't think it's right. Now, our comparison of the details side by side between the narratives according to the Exodus accounts, again, in chapters 19, 20, 21, actually 19, 20, 24, 31, 32, and Deuteronomy 5, 9, and 18, it's going to reveal certain characteristics of our authors, words and phrases, narrative elements that are found in one source and not in another, etc. So, as we look at the study sheet, let's do that now. Hopefully you have had time to pull this up. A couple of things that I want you to notice is that we have bold. Some words are bold and underlined. And the reason I did that is because both in English and Hebrew, these are very close almost exact between the narratives, whether Exodus 20, 24, 31, 32, Deuteronomy 5, 9, 18. In other words, these phrases, these words and phrases, bold and underlined, match across the sources, perhaps indicating that different source compilers are looking at a proto-source behind the later sources. And they both share something quite similar because they're looking at a similar source and then added to according to the details and so forth. Now, what I want to do is, not only do you have the sheet to go by, but I also want to read a few texts. So if you look with me at Deuteronomy 5:22, Deuteronomy 5:22, and that's verse 19 in the Hebrew, I believe. Deuteronomy 5:22. Let me make sure. Yeah. Okay. These are the words Jehovah spake unto all your assembly in the mount, out of the midst of fire, of the cloud, and of the thick darkness, with a great voice, and he added no more, and he wrote them upon 2 tablets of stone, and gave them unto me. And then the narrative continues. Now, in my chart, I only included part A, okay? Let me pull my notes back up here. I only put the first part of 5:22, and I left off that secondary part. You'll see in the chart, and he added no more, 22b, see below. So if you scroll down to page 4 on the chart, you'll see where I put, and he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone and gave them to me. Now, why did I do that? Because according to Deuteronomy 5, when we compare these side by side, we know that the giving of the actual tablet, according to the other narratives that we have, doesn't happen until later. So Deuteronomy 5, verse 22, when you look at it together, it's giving a synopsis of the event, but it's pulling that last detail up. Hopefully that makes sense. If you look at it on the chart, you'll see what I did there. So the idea is that the sources give a different idea about when God gave Moses the tablets, A, or option B, the writer of Deuteronomy 5 is giving an overview and then goes in and tells the rest of the details according to the narrative flow, and we'll look at that as we go back. Now, go back to page 1 on the chart, and now I want to read Deuteronomy 5:4. Deuteronomy 5:4 says the following. Let's see if I can get my electronic Bible to respond here. All right, Deuteronomy 5:4 says the following. Jehovah spake with you face to face in the mount, out of the midst of the fire. I stood between Jehovah and you at that time to show you the word of Jehovah, for you were afraid because of the fire and went not up into the mount. All right, so this indicates the awe-inspiring nature of the event. We see something similar, not exact, but something similar in Exodus. Look with me at Exodus chapter 19, Exodus 19, verse 25 through 20, verse 1. This is on page 116 of the Exodus Torah tablet. And notice it just says, so Moses went down unto the people and told them, and then the next verse says, and God spake all these words, saying. Both of these narratives get us ready for the revelation of the 10 words. Now, both of these texts in Exodus and Deuteronomy claim that what follows are the words that God spoke on the day of assembly, although Deuteronomy uses that phrase and Exodus doesn't. From the midst of the fire, on the day of assembly, God speaks audibly the following words, and then the words are given. But they don't agree. The account in Exodus and the account in Deuteronomy don't agree, but we're not going to go into great detail on that at this time, partly because we've done that in other classes. But we're going to work through this sheet now. We'll come back to some of these ideas. Look at the chart and you'll see Exodus 20, verse 18. In the left-hand column, you'll see the block where it says, the people were afraid and trembled, and they stood far off. Look at Deuteronomy 5, that middle column. For you were afraid because of the fire, and you did not go up into the mountain. And then go down a couple of lines further, and you'll see in chapter 20, verse 19 of Exodus, and said to Moses. See, this is a report in the third person. If I read 28, verse 18 down to 20:19, listen to this. Now, when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled. They stood far off and said to Moses, you speak to us and we will listen. Now, if you look at Deuteronomy, it says, you were afraid because of the fire. You did not go up into the mountain. And as soon as you heard the voice out of the midst of the darkness, while the mountain was burning with fire, you came near to me, all the heads of your tribes and your elders, and said, behold, the Lord our God has shown us his glory and greatness. We've heard his voice out of the midst of the fire. This day we have seen God speak with man, and man still live. Now, therefore, why should we die? For this great fire will consume us. Go near and hear all that the Lord will say, and speak to us all that the Lord our God will speak to you, and we will hear and do it. You see, there's quite a bit of difference here. One is presented as a third-person narrative describing the event, doesn't have all the details, but nonetheless gives you the gist, whereas Deuteronomy is presented as a first-person account. Moses is telling the story. You were afraid. You came to me. Your elders and so forth. He's got the know, see? Someone has the know in this particular text. Now, another thing, if you notice at the bottom of page 1, by the way, the chart has numbers in the bottom right. Page 1, speak to us, we will hear and do it. Now, this, by the way, is interesting because in Deuteronomy, some of you know this, in Deuteronomy, I've covered this in classes before. Years ago, I noticed that Deuteronomy employs 4 verbs very frequently, often together, not always all together. In other words, of the 4 verbs, they are listen, learn, guard, and do, or hear, listen, hear, learn, or teach, guard, or keep, do. You see the different forms of the verb, but listen, learn, guard, and do, they appear lots of times in Deuteronomy and always in that order. So if you only have 2, if it's listen and learn, it's always listen and learn. If it's hear and do in Deuteronomy, it's always, get this, always hear and do. Deuteronomy does not order these do and hear, right? And it becomes a test of the writer of Deuteronomy. Now, I don't know how many other scholars have noticed this, but it's quite instructive. It's almost a test. So, what I want to do now is show you that Exodus doesn't use that same ordering. Look with me at Exodus chapter 24, and we're just going to look at verse 3 and verse 7, which is on page 140 and 141 of the Exodus Torah tablet. Exodus 24, and first we're going to look at verse 3. Moses came and told the people all the words of Jehovah and all the ordinances, and all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words with Jehovah spoken we will do. Not a problem to have the word do, and the people saying they'll do it. But look down at verse 7. And he took the book of the covenant and read in the audience of the people, and they said, all that Jehovah has spoken, we will do. In this translation says, be obedient and be obedient. In Hebrew, it's Shema. It's here. Now, the rabbis make a big deal out of this. They say that the people were so faithful that they agreed to do before they even heard it. And that is championed. That is pushed forward as some great thing that the people were so obedient, which is not true. Anyone who reads the text knows that. So it doesn't help to say that people will do before they even hear the matter. In fact, that's not even smart. We want people to listen, learn, then guard it and do it. I mean, that's the natural order. I've used this example before. If you need some help and you have somebody, you say, hey, look, would you go? And they start to run off. You're like, where are you going? Wait, listen. I'll tell you what I need, and then you do it. So this particular case is a big difference for me between Exodus's narrative and Deuteronomy's narrative. Rather than champion the idea of saying you'll do something before you even hear it, is not something to be applauded. It's something that should be corrected. And that's why Deuteronomy makes it very clear, with no exception, that you're always to listen before you do. And I think that is that's very important for us to get. Now, let me look at one more thing here, okay? Okay, if you look at, now we're on page 2, there is, in all the accounts across the top, there is a fear that if they hear God's voice again, they'll die. You see that? Lest we die, we shall die, lest I die. You see that all the way across. And then you look down at the next section where I have compare Exodus 20 and verse 19. You speak to us and we will listen. Next to it in Deuteronomy, speak to us all that the Lord our God will speak to you, and we will hear and do it. You see that? Okay. Now, I want you to go down, look at the center column, and you'll see Deuteronomy 5, verse 28. And notice that there's nothing corresponding to this in Exodus's account. And the Lord heard your words when you spoke to me, and the Lord said to me, I have heard the words of this people which they have spoken to you. They are right in all that they have spoken. Now, some people don't believe the historicity of any of these texts, but here's something interesting to note. The account in Exodus 20 and the other Exodus text are all in the third person, whereas Deuteronomy is written in the first person. It's as if the most logical conclusion is that the person writing this has an intimate knowledge of what took place that only the writer would know. So that's why Deuteronomy, the Lord said to me. Exodus never has that. Exodus is always third person. Leviticus is always third person. Numbers is always third person. And Deuteronomy is mostly third person. 647 times in the text of the Pentateuch, the name Moses is mentioned. The most logical explanation of that is an author other than Moses wrote that. But here in Deuteronomy, around Horeb, we do have some first-person narration. We have it elsewhere in Deuteronomy too, but this is where we're focused right now. Okay. Now, the other thing that we'll point out is if you look about 3/4 of the way down on page 2, Exodus 20, verse 19 through 23:33, I have the covenant code, a body of laws is given. In other words, in this section, chapter 20, verse 19, all the way to 23:33, there is a whole body of laws that are given. In Deuteronomy, we have a few statutes and judgments from 6:1 to 9:7, but I wanted to just briefly touch on there's some extensive legal codes found in the Pentateuch, and if you look at these side by side, there's repetition, there's discrepancy, and so forth. But here are some of the main bodies of legal codes. If I were you, and I had my Exodus Torah tablet, you might want to write these down. Here they are. The covenant code. What we call the covenant code is Exodus 20 and verse 19 through 23:33. The covenant code. A variant of that is found in Exodus 34, verses 11 through 26. There is some priestly material that is filled with legal material that runs from Exodus 25 all the way to the end of Exodus, all of the book of Leviticus, and the book of Numbers. All of that is pretty much priestly material. In Leviticus, we have specifically what's called the Holiness Code, which runs from Leviticus chapter 17 through 26. We have a Deuteronomic law code in Deuteronomy 11, verse 31 through 28:69. And then we have assorted laws in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 1 through 9, verse 7. Now, next thing I want to do is read 11 verses in Exodus 24. That's page 140 and 142 in the Exodus Torah tablet. Exodus 24:1, and he said unto Moses, Come up unto Jehovah, thou and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and the 70 elders of Israel, and worship ye afar off. And Moses alone shall come near unto Jehovah, but they shall not come near, neither shall the people go up with him. Moses came and told all the people all the words of Jehovah and all the ordinances, and all the people answered with one voice and said, All the words which Jehovah has spoken we will do. Moses spoke all the words of Jehovah and rose up early in the morning and builded an altar under the mount, 12 pillars according to 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the children of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings and oxen unto Jehovah. Moses took half the blood, put it in basins, and half the blood he sprinkled on the altar. He took the book of the covenant and read in the audience of the people, and they said, All Jehovah has spoken we will do and be obedient. Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people, literally flung it on the people, and said, Behold the blood of the covenant which Jehovah has made with you concerning all these words. Then went up Moses and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and the 70 elders of Israel, and they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a paved work of sapphire stone, and as it were, the very heaven for clearness. And upon the nobles of the children of Israel he laid not his hand, and they beheld God and did eat and drink. Well, okay. Now, first of all, this has no corresponding text in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy doesn't know about a meal when they saw God. Deuteronomy, in fact, makes a very clear point all the way through the text. You didn't see anything. You didn't see anything. You heard a voice. You didn't see anything. Don't ever make anything because you didn't see anything. Exodus said, oh, yeah, they saw. They saw God. And it goes into great detail. There's no mention in Deuteronomy about sacrifices taking place. This thing in Exodus about the people offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings, oxen, and Moses taking the blood and so forth, Deuteronomy doesn't have any of that. So you say, well, why is that? Well, one reason could be that there is a tension in the text. And that tension in the text suggests one side says there were no sacrifices in the wilderness. Now, this sets people's hair on fire when they hear this. I know that. But I have to say it because the Bible says it. So let's look at a couple of verses, and let me give you those passages that are very important in this regard. And we're going to start in Amos. We're going to go to Amos chapter 5, Amos 5, and verse 25. And here's what it says. Did ye bring unto me sacrifices and offerings in the wilderness 40 years, O house of Israel? Now, I know I'm just reading one verse, but what do you think that the writer intends that answer to be? Of course, it's supposed to be God speaking. Did you offer me sacrifices in the wilderness 40 years? Now, a fundamentalist would say, yeah, in fact, we did. But is that what is intended here? Now, let's look at another text. Go with me to Jeremiah chapter 7. Now, do other people have different understandings of these texts? Of course they do. Of course they do, because it has to fit with their fundamentalist theology. But listen to this, Jeremiah 7:21. Thus says Jehovah of hosts, God of Israel, add your burnt offerings to your sacrifices, and eat ye flesh. For I spake not unto your fathers, nor commanded them in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt, concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices. But this thing I commanded them, saying, hearken unto my voice, and I'll be your God, and ye shall be my people. Walk ye in all the way that I command you, that it may be well with you. But they hearkened not, nor inclined their ear, but walked in their own counsels, and in the stubbornness of their evil heart went backward and not forward. Since the day your fathers came out of the land of Egypt unto this day, and I've sent unto you all my servants the prophets, daily rising up early and sending them, yet they hearken not unto me, nor inclined their ear, but made their necks stiff. They did worse than their fathers. Very interesting. There's one more passage just for you to consider. And believe me, there are many of these texts. I'm just giving a few. Exodus 20 and 25. Jehovah speaking, ladies and gentlemen. Moreover, also, I gave them statutes that were not good, and ordinances wherein they should not live. I don't know what that is. And I polluted them in their own gifts, in that they caused to pass through the fire all that opened the womb, that I might make them desolate. Some translations say horrify them, to the end that they might know that I am Jehovah. Interesting. Now, so how is it that Exodus has this whole section, part of this covenant idea, and the flinging of blood on the people and the sacrifices being offered, and we get these other we get these other sources which say no, there was no sacrificing in the wilderness. Now, it's not that I'm not familiar with text that suggests that there are sacrifices in the wilderness. I'm very familiar with the biblical text. But whenever you have a tension in the text, you have one side says, no, that didn't happen. You have another side that says, yes, it did. We have to make a decision. Now, theologically, that decision is made theologically by people who have a need for that sacrificial cult. But the question needs to come back to which of these stories represents something more akin to what might be historically accurate and then the other. So these are the things that we have to consider. Now, look with me at Exodus 24, verses 12 through 17. This is on page 142 of the tablet. And the Lord said unto Moses, wait, let me pull up the ESV. Exodus 24, one second. And 12 through 17. Here we go. Jehovah said unto Moses, Come up to me unto the mount, and be there, and I will give thee the tables of stone, the law and the commandments which I have written, that thou mayest teach them. Moses rose up, and Joshua his minister. Moses went up into the mountain of God, and he said unto the elders, Tarry ye here for us, until we come again unto you. And behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whosoever hath a cause, let him come near unto them. And Moses went up into the mount, and the cloud covered the mount, and the glory of Jehovah abode upon Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. The seventh day called out unto Moses out of the midst of the cloud. The appearance of the glory of Jehovah was like a devouring fire on top of the mountain in the eyes of the children of Israel. And then Moses enters the midst of the cloud, and so forth. And Moses was in the mount 40 days and 40 nights. Okay. Now, there's no match for that in Deuteronomy. The first time we get a match between Exodus' story that I just read in 24 and Deuteronomy is Moses relates, then I went up into the mountain, okay? But the last thing that we see, in other words, none of that stuff is there. It says in 9:9, I went into the mountain to receive the tablets of stone, tablets of the covenant that the Lord made with you, and I remained on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. Now look at the Exodus version. Moses entered the cloud and went up on the mountain, and Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. You see the difference between the first and third person? In Exodus, it says Moses did this. We could see, went in the, and Deuteronomy says, and then I went in on the mountain. I was there for 40 days. And then notice on the chart that chapter 25, now we're in Exodus, chapter 25, verse 1 through 31:17, more laws. Like more laws, again. We just keep getting more and more laws, okay? Now, the next part is where we get some correspondence between Exodus's account and Deuteronomy accounts in both 5 and in 9. So you'll notice Exodus 31:18, and he gave to Moses, when he finished speaking with him on Mount Sinai, the 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone written with the finger of God. Chapter 5, verse 22, center column, and he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone and gave them to me, first person. And the Lord gave me, verse 10, right-hand column, and the Lord gave me the 2 tablets of stone written with the finger of God. And on them were all the words that the Lord had spoken with you on the mountain, out of the midst of the fire, on the day of assembly. And at the end of 40 days and 40 nights, the Lord gave me the 2 tablets of stone, the tablets of the covenant. Notice the difference, first versus third person. And then the last page of the document, Exodus 32:15b through 16, 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand, tablets that were written on both sides, on the front and on the back. They were written. Tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God engraved on the tablets. Now, I hope that this exercise has been beneficial for you. We're going to continue to use this method, horizontally studying, synoptically studying the text. Remember, synoptic, to view together. We're going to view stories and narratives that are mentioned in different sources, and we're going to look at them side by side, and we're going to ask ourselves, which one of these more accurately reflects the view? Let's say if we look at Amos chapter 5, verse 25, and Jeremiah chapter 7. Remember, in Jeremiah's day, the authentic scroll that Moses wrote was discovered. He found it. When he said, when your words were found, I ate them. And remember, he goes out and he preaches against the priesthood. And he preaches not only against the priesthood, he actually, in the temple, he calls it a den of ravenous, it says thieves in English, but it's like, it's almost a word for a violent ones, this den of a cave of violence. He calls the temple a cave of violence. And not only that, he also says in Jeremiah 7 that God never told them to sacrifice when they left Egypt. So we have two different stories. We have a third-person account in Exodus, which describes at Horeb, and they're offering sacrifices and the blood of the covenant and all that. Deuteronomy is first person, doesn't mention any of that. So when we look at things synoptically, maybe we're able to determine, hey, they're different, but is one more accurate than the other? Those are questions that we have to examine and we have to entertain. Why does one writer mention things that are left out of another account? Why are some versions in first person and others in the third? The horizontal study of these texts will prove to be the most important method of study in our common quest for truth. Thank you very much for joining me today. Shabbat Shalom. And listen, if you're part of the Yakad, thank you very much for your continual support. Meet me in the Zoom. For those of you who are not yet members of the Yakad, you will be redirected to a YouTube where you can watch as well. Thank you very much. I'll see you shortly.